Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a time when Southeast Asia was not the bustling, modern patchwork of nations you might picture on a travel brochure, but a territory drawn and quartered by foreign ambition. You're not sitting in your chair anymore. You're wandering humid streets in 19th century Hanoi, the scent of wet earth mingling with coal smoke. Above you, French colonial banners hang heavy in the damp air. And if you're expecting a peaceful stroll, well, you probably won't survive this stroll for long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the time on the clock where you are. I always love seeing how far these bedtime journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in French Indochina. The French called it their civilizing mission, but to the farmers tilling rice paddies under the punishing sun, it often felt more like backbreaking taxes, land seizures, and a foreign language that shoved aside their own. French Indochina wasn't just Vietnam. It was a patchwork quilt, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam stitched together by force. You picture colonial officials sipping coffee in shaded courtyards while outside, ox carts creaked under loads of rice and rubber destined for European markets. A mainstream historical fact sets the scene. By the late 19th century, France had firmly established control, officially declaring the colony in 1887. Hanoi became a showcase capital, complete with wide boulevards modeled on Paris. But what looked elegant on the surface often hid simmering resentment below. You walk through a crowded marketplace. A French official in a stiff white uniform passes by, barely nodding to the vendors. A woman mutters under her breath, and you catch just a word: Ingwe Fap, the French. You realize how deep the resentment runs. Education is offered, yes, but mostly in French. A handful of Vietnamese elites are given access to Western schooling, creating a thin layer of collaborators and interpreters. For everyone else, the promise of modernity looks a lot like debt and forced labor. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. French administrators once tried to standardize street lighting in Hanoi by importing Parisian gas lamps. Villagers nearby joked that the lights attracted more moths than they deterred thieves. Even progress could feel absurdly out of place. Still, you sense the stirrings of something beneath the surface. Secret societies gather in hidden rooms, whispering about freedom. Intellectuals read French Enlightenment philosophy, Rousseau, Voltaire, and twist those words back against their occupiers. You stand at the edge of a classroom where a teacher carefully explains Confucian values, then flips casually into French revolutionary slogans. It's a curious mix. Confucius meets Robespierre. Historians still argue whether French colonialism unintentionally created the very nationalism that would later tear it down. On one hand, the French brought modern roads, telegraphs, and a sense of a unified Vietnam under a single administration. On the other, their heavy-handed exploitation, rice exports shipped abroad even as locals starved, only deepened the hunger for independence. The more you listen, the more you understand that resistance isn't born overnight. It's cultivated like rice, season by season. The peasants you pass are quietly furious about land redistribution policies that favor landlords loyal to France. Taxes pile up. Traditional village autonomy shrinks. The French insist this is progress, but for the average family, it's like being pressed under a foreign boot. A breeze carries you into the highlands, where minority groups like the Montagnards live. Here, French missionaries have carved deep influence, converting some to Catholicism, setting up missions. Yet even these mountain communities feel the pull of nationalist calls from the lowlands. You sense how complex this landscape really is. Religion, ethnicity, language, all tied into the colonial knot. And in the shadows, a name begins to echo. Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known as Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890, he grows up under this colonial order. You imagine a boy watching French soldiers march, the strange sound of their boots against stone streets, the blend of curiosity and quiet rage forming in his young mind. By the early 20th century, you see strikes ripple through plantations. Rubber workers refuse to pick. Students protest in Saigon. Newspapers spring up, written in Quoc Ngu, the Romanized Vietnamese script the French once promoted for convenience. Ironically, it becomes a tool for spreading anti-colonial thought faster than old classical Chinese ever could. Another example of unintended consequences. There's even a moment of dark comedy in this history. Some French officers complained they couldn't distinguish between rebels and ordinary villagers because everyone wore the same conical hats. The very thing that made peasants blend into the landscape became a perfect disguise. No camo required. But it wasn't just anger. It was identity. Vietnam's story stretches back 1,000 years, resisting Chinese domination, building dynasties, cultivating a fierce pride in independence. French colonialism wasn't just exploitation, it was an insult to centuries of resilience. Every rice farmer bent over his crop remembered ancestors who fought invaders. Every temple still whispered legends of warriors who stood against foreign empires. As you continue down a narrow dirt path, you overhear two elders argue softly. One says the French bring progress, schools, medicine. The other spits into the dust, calling it all theft with pretty packaging. You realize the debates of that time mirror questions people still ask today. Does modernity justify foreign rule? Or is freedom worth more, even at the cost of comfort? That tension builds, year by year. Resistance movements like the Chan Vuong rise, calling for loyalty to the Vietnamese emperor against French control. Though suppressed, they leave embers that never go out. Secret student groups in Paris and Hanoi write pamphlets, dreaming of a free Vietnam. And you, slipping through the haze of time, feel the stage being set. The colony looks solid, the tricolor flag flying proudly over Saigon's port, but you can almost hear the cracks spreading underfoot. The resentment is quiet, but relentless. It's in every unpaid tax, every child barred from opportunity, every prayer whispered in anger. As the century turns and the world races toward larger wars, Vietnam carries this heavy weight. The memory of independence, the humiliation of subjugation, and the hunger for something different. Tonight, you carry that too, in the humid air pressing against your skin, in the silence of villagers who no longer believe the French promise of civilization. You drift forward through time, and suddenly, the streets of Hanoi no longer echo with the shuffle of colonial soldiers in white uniforms. Instead, they rattle under the weight of new boots, Japanese boots. It's the early 1940s, and the Second World War has turned the globe upside down. France itself has fallen to Nazi Germany, and in the confusion, Japan decides Southeast Asia is ripe for the taking. You can almost smell the tension in the air, like smoke hanging over a market before a storm. Japan doesn't waltz in with promises of enlightenment like the French had. They arrive with sharp bayonets and a tight smile, promising Asia for Asians. You hear those words whispered in propaganda leaflets, painted on banners, even murmured in dark corners of Saigon's cafes. But you also hear the mutter under the breath of farmers. Different master, same chains. A mainstream fact sets the stage. In 1940, Japanese forces pressured Vichy France, the collaborationist government back in Europe, into allowing their troops into Indochina. By 1941, they controlled the region outright, using its ports and railways to funnel supplies for the war against China. France was technically still there, but like a puppet whose strings were yanked tighter every day. As you drift among the villages, you notice something strange. In the shadows of occupation, a different kind of energy stirs. Out of the ashes of colonial oppression, a man named Ho Chi Minh re-emerges. He's been abroad for decades. France, the Soviet Union, China, studying Marxism, organizing movements, sending letters to world leaders that mostly went unread. Now he slips back into Vietnam like smoke seeping under a door. His presence isn't loud, it's whispered. A pamphlet here, a meeting there. But you sense a spark catching. Here's the quirky tidbit. Ho Chi Minh once worked in Boston as a pastry chef's assistant before all this. Imagine that, a man dusted in flour, wiping down counters, who would one day lead a revolutionary movement that shook the world's strongest powers. Sometimes history hides in kitchens before it bursts onto battlefields. Back in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh rallies together a group called the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. Their motto is simple enough: kick out the foreigners. It doesn't matter whether they're French or Japanese. What matters is freedom. And unlike earlier resistance movements, this one blends communist ideology with fierce nationalism, a combination sharp enough to slice through centuries of domination. Historians still argue whether Ho's priority was truly national independence or the spread of international communism. Was he a patriot first or a Marxist above all? Maybe he was both. Maybe he played the angles as needed. But what you feel, standing in the dark jungle, is the determination of a man and a movement that refuses to be erased. Meanwhile, the Japanese occupation grows harsher. In 1944 and 1945, disaster strikes. A famine sweeps across northern Vietnam, killing an estimated 2 million people. Picture endless fields of rice, yet the villagers are starving. Much of the rice is seized by Japan to feed its troops or redirected to export markets, while Allied bombing disrupts transport. You walk through a village and see children with hollow eyes, mothers holding bowls scraped clean, men too weak to stand. For them, Asia for Asians feels like a cruel joke. The famine becomes a turning point. The Viet Minh seize the moment, distributing rice when they can, pointing to Japanese greed as the cause of suffering. Their propaganda spreads like wildfire. Suddenly, they're not just rebels, they're saviors in the eyes of many villagers. And you, trudging through mud-soaked paths at night, sense how power doesn't always come from guns. Sometimes it comes from a handful of rice given to a starving family. Another scene. Guerrilla fighters in sandals made from old tires crouch by a campfire. They laugh softly as one jokes about Japanese soldiers who can't handle jungle leeches, slapping at their boots while the locals barely notice. It's a reminder that resilience sometimes lies in small humiliations inflicted on an occupier. You can almost hear the squelch of mud between your own toes. By 1945, the war turns. Japan begins to collapse under US pressure in the Pacific. Then, in August, the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders. But before that surrender, in March 1945, the Japanese overthrow what remained of French authority in Indochina. For the first time in decades, the French are gone from the picture, at least temporarily. It's here that you witness something breathtaking: the August Revolution. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh move swiftly, filling the power vacuum. Crowds gather in Hanoi, waving flags of red with a golden star. A proclamation echoes through loudspeakers. Vietnam is independent. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stands in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi and declares the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. His speech begins with words borrowed straight from the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And here's the irony you can't ignore. The United States, built on those very ideals, had in fact helped the Viet Minh during the war, supplying weapons and training to fight the Japanese. For a brief, flickering moment, you might think Washington would back Vietnam's independence. After all, they had fought together against fascism. But as you hover in that square, listening to Ho's voice carry across the crowd, you sense the tragic twist coming. America will soon see Ho not as an ally, but as a communist threat. The square smells of sweat and incense. Children tug on their mother's sleeves, asking if they are finally free. Ho's thin frame looks almost fragile against the podium, but his words cut like steel. Independence, equality, freedom. Vietnam is theirs at last. For one glowing moment, people believe it, but, like a cruel dream, the vision fades quickly. The French, humiliated but not broken, prepare to return. The Americans, uncertain of how to balance anti-colonial ideals with their growing obsession about containing communism, hesitate. The British, helping France re-establish order in the South, even rearm captured Japanese soldiers to suppress Vietnamese nationalists. Imagine that. Men who were yesterday's enemies now ordered to fight yesterday's allies. You step aside as gunfire cracks in Saigon. Independence had been declared, yes, but it was not secure. The revolution gave a taste of freedom, but the banquet was still out of reach. So as World War II ends, Vietnam stands at a crossroads. You can feel it in your bones. The people are tired of foreign masters. They've endured French taxes, Japanese famine, endless humiliation. They have leaders now, a flag, a dream. Yet the world's powers are about to redraw the map again. And Vietnam's fate hangs in that tangled web of diplomacy and ideology. The fire has been lit, but it's only the beginning of a long night. And you, still wandering through the crowd, brushing shoulders with villagers who don't yet know what's coming, feel the storm building on the horizon. The war has ended, at least on paper, and the globe exhales. But in Vietnam, your lungs tighten as if the air itself refuses to relax. The Japanese are gone, their empire shattered, and in their absence, a question dangles over every rice field and city street. Who owns this land now? You drift down Saigon's avenues, still littered with propaganda posters and bullet holes. One shopkeeper whispers that freedom has come. Another shakes his head, muttering that the French are on their way back. The mood feels like the uneasy silence after a monsoon, when you know the next storm is already forming. A mainstream fact anchors you here. In September 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam independent in Hanoi. Yet, by the end of the year, French troops had landed again in southern Vietnam, determined to reclaim what they called their colony. They weren't alone. The British had quietly helped by rearming Japanese prisoners of war to police Saigon until French reinforcements arrived. Yes, you heard that right. Yesterday's enemy enlisted to suppress today's allies. If it feels absurd, it was. You wander through the alleys of Saigon and spot Japanese soldiers now patrolling under French command, bayonets glinting in the tropical sun. The locals look on with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Independence had barely tasted sweet before it was yanked away like a toy from a child's hands. Meanwhile, America hovers in the background like a restless giant not sure which way to step. Franklin Roosevelt had once opposed the return of French colonialism, hinting that Indochina should move toward independence. But Roosevelt is gone, and Harry Truman sits in the White House. His advisors see the world less through anti-colonial eyes and more through the thick, cold lens of containment. The Soviet Union looms large. Communism seems to spread like an unchecked fire, and Ho Chi Minh's Marxist leanings set off alarm bells in Washington. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the summer of 1945, Ho actually wrote letters to Truman, pleading for American support of Vietnamese independence. He even cited the U.S. Declaration of Independence, hoping the shared ideals would resonate. None of those letters received a reply. It's the kind of ghost mail that makes you wonder how history might have changed if someone had simply opened the envelope. Historians still argue whether the U.S. had a real choice in that moment. Could Truman have backed Ho and steered him away from Moscow's orbit? Or was Ho always destined to align with the communist bloc? Some claim his nationalism outweighed ideology. Others insist the Marxist creed was baked too deep into his worldview. What you know, standing here in Saigon's heat, is that decisions made half a world away will soon shape the lives of millions. By late 1946, tensions snap. Skirmishes between French troops and Viet Minh forces in Hanoi erupt into open conflict. You picture the capital as it was: narrow streets, red flags fluttering from rooftops, gunfire echoing in alleys. For the French, this is about pride and empire. For the Viet Minh, it's survival and destiny. For the United States, it's about which side of the Cold War line Vietnam will stand on. You crouch beside a family huddled in their home, clutching what little they own. The father mutters that the French can never hold this land forever, but the mother's eyes dart nervously. She knows foreign powers don't leave quickly. Already, the Viet Minh are retreating into the jungles, preparing for the long fight. Guerrilla camps sprout like mushrooms after rain, hidden in the dense foliage of the north. Meanwhile, in Washington, advisors draw up memos. They worry about the domino effect, the idea that if one nation falls to communism, its neighbors will topple after it, like tiles flicked over by an unseen hand. Indochina, perched beside China, seems too important to lose. And so, America makes its fateful choice. Despite having once fought alongside the Viet Minh against Japan, it will back France. Aid begins to flow. Money, equipment, political support, all to prop up a colonial war that few Americans really understand. And here's where you notice another irony. French generals often spoke of restoring order, but many of their soldiers were not French at all. Colonial troops from North Africa, Senegal, and Madagascar were sent to fight in Vietnam, young men plucked from one empire's edges to suppress another. You watch as Algerian infantry trudge through rice paddies, muttering in Arabic about how strange and wet this land feels. It's empire fighting empire with borrowed bodies. By 1947, the war settles into a grim rhythm. French forces hold cities and key roads, while the Viet Minh melt into the countryside, striking and vanishing. You drift into a tunnel near the Red River Delta. It's dark, damp, the air thick with smoke from a hidden cooking fire. Fighters crouch with rusty rifles, maps scribbled by candlelight. They joke that French troops look lost without their baguettes, laughter muffled by the earth above. You realize that humor, even in war, is as much a weapon as the rifles. The French believe superior firepower will break resistance. Planes roar overhead, villages are bombed, rice fields scorched. But for every attack, more peasants join the Viet Minh, enraged at the destruction of their homes. You feel the futility of the strategy in your bones. It's like trying to drain the ocean with a teacup. At the same time, the Viet Minh don't just fight with bullets. They launch land reforms in the areas they control, redistributing estates from landlords to peasants. It's not always clean, and sometimes it turns violent. But to the farmer who suddenly owns the land he tills, the message is clear. The Viet Minh stand for justice. The French, by contrast, still look like foreigners clinging to a world that is crumbling. By 1949, the global stage tilts further. Mao Zedong's communists win in China, creating a massive new neighbor sympathetic to the Viet Minh. Soviet support deepens. For Washington, alarms now blare at full volume. France warns that without American aid, Indochina will be lost. And so, the checks keep coming, tying the U.S. more deeply to a colonial war it never meant to inherit. Here's one of those little-known tidbits. In French propaganda leaflets, they often depicted the Viet Minh as puppets of Moscow. But in practice, many Viet Minh fighters had never seen a Soviet gun, let alone a Russian advisor, in those early years. Most of them carried captured French rifles or homemade grenades, proof that resilience doesn't always need a superpower's blessing. Historians still debate whether the U.S. support for France was a pragmatic necessity or a colossal missed opportunity. Some argue America had to show solidarity with Europe against communism, especially with NATO forming. Others suggest Washington could have recognized Ho Chi Minh's nationalist movement and built ties before the Soviet embrace became too strong. Standing here in the humid air, watching villagers debate in whispers over a bowl of pho, you feel the weight of choices that can't be unmade. The late 1940s bleed into the early 1950s, and the war grinds on. For most Vietnamese, life becomes a cycle of toil and fear. Fields by day, hiding by night, caught between French reprisals and Viet Minh demands. You sit under a starlit sky and hear a farmer sigh, "We just want peace." But peace isn't on the horizon. Instead, a showdown approaches that will shake not just Vietnam, but the entire balance of the Cold War. And so you keep moving forward, the jungle buzzing in your ears, the sound of distant artillery rolling like thunder across the mountains. The French cling to their empire, the Viet Minh sharpen their resolve, and America edges closer, step by hesitant step, into a quagmire it still thinks it can avoid. The humid air thickens as you walk uphill through the northern valleys, your feet sliding on mud that feels endless. Suddenly, the jungle parts and you're standing on a ridge looking down at a basin surrounded by mountains. It's 1954, and the name of this place is about to be seared into history. Dien Bien Phu. To the casual eye, it's just a remote valley. But to French commanders, it's the key to breaking the Viet Minh once and for all. You can almost hear their optimism echoing across the hills. This time, they believe superior firepower and fortified positions will finally crush the rebellion. A mainstream fact. Dien Bien Phu was the climactic battle of the First Indochina War. The French, under General Navarre, fortified the valley with the idea of drawing the Viet Minh into a set-piece fight, confident that artillery and air support would guarantee victory. Instead, it became the graveyard of French colonial ambitions. You picture French soldiers digging trenches, laying barbed wire, and building bunkers out of sandbags and timber. Paratroopers drop supplies from the sky, parachutes blooming like dandelions over the valley. On paper, the base seems impregnable, but as you turn your gaze to the hills, you notice something the French overlooked. Those ridges aren't empty. Viet Minh troops are already hauling artillery piece by piece, dragging heavy guns up slopes with ropes and sweat, sometimes disassembling them to move through jungle trails. It's almost unthinkable. How do you get a cannon onto a mountain without roads? The answer is grit, manpower, and a lot of determination. Here's the quirky tidbit. Viet Minh forces reportedly used bicycles reinforced with bamboo and steel to transport supplies. These weren't leisurely bikes with wicker baskets. They were overloaded with up to 300 pounds of rice or ammunition, pushed by hand along narrow jungle paths. Imagine the absurdity of winning a war with bicycles. But it worked. When the siege begins in March 1954, you feel the ground shake with each shell. French artillery fires back, but the Viet Minh guns, hidden in the hills and camouflaged with leaves, rain destruction into the valley below. Every supply drop becomes a gamble. Parachutes often land in Viet Minh hands instead of French trenches. You crouch with a young French soldier, mud caking his helmet, as he mutters that the jungle itself seems to hate them. Historians still argue whether Dien Bien Phu was doomed from the start or lost due to poor French decisions during the siege. Some point to underestimating Viet Minh logistics. Others blame overconfidence in air superiority. Either way, what you see is clear. The French trapped themselves in a bowl, and Giap, the Viet Minh commander, turned that bowl into a coffin. Week after week, the siege grinds on. Food runs short. Water turns foul and morale sinks. Letters home are filled with despair, though few ever reach their destination. In one bunker, soldiers joke about trading their rations for a single glass of Bordeaux wine. A gallows humor that almost makes you smile in the darkness. Almost. Meanwhile, General Vo Nguyen Giap orchestrates the battle like a chess master. He avoids rushing the French positions and instead squeezes tighter, trench by trench, like a python around its prey. His strategy is simple. Bleed the enemy slowly, sap their strength, and break their will. And it works. You crawl through a muddy Viet Minh trench, hearing whispers of encouragement. Men sharing cigarettes under flickering lanterns, their faces thin but eyes burning. They believe they're on the cusp of history. By May, the French position collapses. The last radio messages crackle with despair. Commanders call for more support, but none comes. You watch as French soldiers, once confident in their forts and airfields, stagger out as prisoners, mud-smeared and broken. Nearly 11,000 are captured, For France, the humiliation is complete. Dien Bien Phu is not just a defeat, it's a death knell for their empire in Southeast Asia. Another odd little detail. Some French officers refused to surrender their prized swords, clinging to a symbol of honor even as everything else was lost. It's almost theatrical, like insisting on wearing a tuxedo while the ship sinks. The ripple effects are immediate. News spreads across the globe. A colonial power, armed with modern weapons, has been beaten by a nationalist guerrilla army from the jungles. To colonized peoples everywhere, it's a spark of hope. To colonial powers, it's a warning siren. And to the United States, watching closely, it's a question mark. If France can't win here, who can? Historians still debate the role of external support in this victory. Chinese advisors and supplies certainly helped the Viet Minh, but the core of the triumph lay in local willpower and ingenuity. What's undeniable is that the French were outmaneuvered, outlasted, and ultimately outmatched by an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. Now you're standing in Geneva, Switzerland, where diplomats in crisp suits shuffle papers and sip coffee. The Geneva Conference of 1954 is convened to settle the Indochina conflict. Around the table, powers carve up the map like it's a chessboard. Vietnam will be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The North under Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, the South under a US-backed anti-communist regime. The division is supposed to be temporary, with nationwide elections scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. You can almost hear the cynical laughter, because deep down, you know those elections will never happen. Here's where you catch another irony. Even President Eisenhower later admitted he believed Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote in a fair election. But fair doesn't fit the Cold War script. For Washington, letting a communist win by ballot was no different than letting him win by bullet. And so the stage shifts again. France packs up and sails away, its colonial dream shattered. Into the vacuum steps America, hesitant at first but already calculating. The South needs shoring up, the North is celebrating victory, and between them lies a line on the map that isn't just about Vietnam anymore. It's about the future of the Cold War itself. You walk along that invisible line, the 17th parallel, a river cutting through green fields. Farmers on one side glance nervously toward the other, wondering if their families will ever be reunited. Soldiers build posts, string wire, and dig bunkers. The land itself seems confused, half free, half trapped, waiting for the next chapter. As the sun sets behind the mountains, the air feels heavy with anticipation. Dien Bien Phu is over, but the war is not. Instead, it has only shifted shape. And you, wandering through the gathering dusk, can't shake the feeling that this division will not hold, that the storm is only beginning to gather strength. The war drums fall silent, but only for a breath. You stand at the 17th parallel, where the Geneva Accords have sliced Vietnam into two uneasy halves. To the north, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic celebrates victory, red flags snapping in the breeze. To the south, a patchwork government, propped up by Western promises, tries to steady its trembling legs. And you, caught in the middle, feel how fragile the arrangement really is. Like glass balanced on the edge of a table. A mainstream fact sets the tone. After 1954, Vietnam was divided into North and South, with nationwide elections promised for 1956. Those elections never came. The United States and its allies, fearing Ho Chi Minh's popularity, quietly supported canceling them, effectively freezing Vietnam into two opposing states. You wander through Saigon streets in the late 1950s, and the contrast with Hanoi is sharp. In the south, neon lights buzz over French cafes, motorbikes sputter past colonial-era villas, and government officials hold lavish banquets. But scratch the surface, and the rot shows. Corruption oozes from every office. Bribes grease the wheels of bureaucracy. Generals grow fat, while peasants remain landless. President Ngo Dinh, backed firmly by Washington, promises reform but rules with an iron grip, favoring his Catholic minority over the Buddhist majority. Here's the quirky tidbit. Diem once banned beauty contests in Saigon, calling them immoral. But he had no qualms about lavish, family-controlled business monopolies that drain the economy. Priorities, right? You drift into a rural hamlet outside the city, where the picture is even bleaker. Landlords still collect rents from tenant farmers, and promises of redistribution dissolve into paperwork and excuses. Villagers mutter that the government cares little for their struggles. And in the shadows, whispers spread. Whispers of the Viet Minh, who never truly vanished after Geneva, who now move quietly under a new name, the Viet Cong. Historians still argue whether Diem could have succeeded with stronger reforms, or whether his regime was doomed from the start by its narrow base of support. Some say he was simply out of touch. Others claim he had no real chance, caught between Cold War expectations and Vietnam's complex social fabric. Standing in that hamlet, watching farmers sell their last chickens to pay taxes, you suspect the latter. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh consolidates power. His land reforms are sweeping and brutal. Landlords executed, fields redistributed, villages transformed. The policy sparks both gratitude and terror. Families who once toiled for landlords suddenly own their plots, but others whisper of mistakes, of innocents accused, of chaos in the countryside. The North is reshaping itself into a communist society, and while messy, it breeds loyalty among those who feel they finally have something worth defending. You step into a smoky room where North Vietnamese officials pore over maps. Their strategy is clear: support the insurgency in the south, undermine Diem's fragile state, and prepare for the long struggle. The Ho Chi Minh Trail begins to take shape, snaking through Laos and Cambodia, a lifeline of supplies and men. At this moment, it looks like little more than jungle tracks, but you sense how vital it will become. Back in Saigon, Diem grows increasingly paranoid. He cracks down on opposition, censors newspapers, and jails critics. His secret police sweep up students and monks alike. The more he clamps down, the more resentment boils. One monk mutters that even the French allowed more freedom than this. It's a dangerous comparison. And then comes the spark you can't forget: Buddhist protests. In 1963, monks light themselves on fire in Saigon streets, their silent immolation a scream louder than any words. You stand frozen, the smell of burning cloth in your nostrils, watching as crowds gasp and soldiers shuffle uneasily. Diem's indifference only deepens outrage. Washington, once his biggest backer, begins to doubt whether their man in Saigon is really the man to hold the South together. Here's another odd detail. American officials often described Diem as the Churchill of Southeast Asia in the 1950s. By the 1960s, the nickname vanished, replaced by whispers that he was out of touch and uncontrollable. That's the danger of building a hero on paper. You sometimes forget the paper can burn. Historians still debate the American role in Diem's downfall. Officially, Washington didn't order his overthrow. But by late 1963, when South Vietnamese generals staged a coup and assassinated him, the U.S. did little to stop it. You can almost hear the diplomatic shrugs. Better to roll the dice with new leadership than cling to a sinking ship. Yet killing the captain doesn't save the boat. After Diem, South Vietnam plunges into chaos. Coups follow coups, generals backstab one another, corruption deepens, and the Viet Cong grow bolder. You drift through a military barracks where officers toast themselves with French cognac while outside, peasants curse both sides, caught between government troops by day and insurgents by night. And America? America watches with growing unease. At first, Eisenhower and Kennedy kept U.S. involvement limited. Advisors, money, equipment. Kennedy famously sent Green Berets to train South Vietnamese troops, believing a limited commitment might suffice. But each month, the commitment grows deeper. By the time Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, over 16,000 American military advisors are already in Vietnam. You walk among them as they demonstrate weapons to South Vietnamese recruits. One GI jokes about the heat melting his boots. Another complains the locals don't trust them. Beneath the laughter, there's a thread of unease. The ground feels unstable beneath your feet. South Vietnam looks less like a sturdy ally and more like a house built on sand. Corruption, repression, and endless political infighting eat at its foundations. Meanwhile, the North waits patiently, feeding the insurgency, testing America's resolve. You pause in a Saigon market, hearing merchants debate. One says, America will save them. Another mutters that America will just replace France as a foreign master. The truth feels slippery, like trying to hold water in your hands. By 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson sits in the White House, inheriting the tangled mess. He faces a choice: let South Vietnam collapse and risk looking weak against communism, or escalate U.S. involvement and gamble everything. You sense the gears turning, the tension mounting, and the storm gathering once more. The division of 1954 was supposed to be temporary. Instead, it hardened into fault lines. Corruption rotted the South, and insurgency sprouted from the soil. The people's loyalty, always the real prize, slipped further away from Saigon's grasp. And you, standing under the sweltering sun, realize you're not watching peace collapse. You're watching the next war ignite. You drift into the early 1960s, and the streets of Saigon hum with a strange mix of energy and dread. At first glance, it almost looks like a normal city. Rickshaws clatter past French-built villas. School children laugh on their way to class. American cars gleam in the tropical sun. But if you listen closely, beneath the laughter is a nervous heartbeat. The coups that toppled Ngo Dinh Diem have left the South's leadership unstable. A carousel of generals, each promising stability, each failing to deliver. You can taste the uncertainty in the air, like humidity before a thunderstorm. A mainstream fact anchors the moment. By 1964, the United States had about 23,000 military personnel in Vietnam. They weren't officially combat troops, at least that's what the paperwork said. They were advisors sent to help train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. But advisors with rifles and helicopters and napalm don't look much different from soldiers. And you can see it in the villages. The war is already here, just without the headlines. You follow one of these advisors into a rural hamlet. He's young, maybe 22, from Iowa or Texas, and already sweating through his uniform. He tries to explain tactics to ARVN recruits, but the recruits shift uncomfortably, their loyalty uncertain, their pay irregular. Later, you overhear him writing a letter home, telling his parents he's helping to defend freedom. You know he doesn't believe every word. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some early American advisors in Vietnam wore cowboy hats during helicopter rides, a playful nod to the Wild West spirit they imagined themselves embodying. It looked cinematic, sure, but the locals watching from rice paddies probably just shook their heads at the bizarre sight of cowboys in the jungle. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Kennedy had once hoped that small, elite units, the Green Berets, could train South Vietnam to handle its own defense. He even approved counterinsurgency programs like the Strategic Hamlet Program, designed to move villagers into fortified settlements to isolate them from Viet Cong influence. On paper, it sounded logical. Keep peasants safe, cut off the guerrillas. In practice, it often meant uprooting families from ancestral land and herding them into barbed wire enclosures. You walk through one of these hamlets, rows of shoddy huts surrounded by fences. The villagers stare at you with a mixture of confusion and resentment. Freedom doesn't feel like barbed wire. Historians still argue whether Kennedy truly intended to escalate, or whether he planned to pull out U.S. forces after the 1964 election. Some point to his public speeches about bearing any burden to stop communism. Others cite private memos suggesting he wanted an exit. But Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 left the question hanging like unfinished music. Now Lyndon B. Johnson sits in the Oval Office, inheriting Vietnam along with civil rights battles, poverty programs, and the shadow of Kennedy's legacy. Johnson doesn't want to lose South Vietnam. He fears it would brand him weak, a man who lost Asia the way Truman had supposedly lost China. You can almost hear the political calculations in every word he speaks about dominoes and credibility. And then, in August 1964, the storm breaks, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Official reports claim North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked U.S. destroyers in international waters. In reality, the first attack happened but caused little damage. The second attack may never have occurred at all. Radar blips, nervous sailors, and miscommunication morphed into enemy aggression on paper. You stand on the deck of the USS Maddox, the sea calm, the crew jumpy. One sailor mutters that they're firing at shadows. Back home, Johnson seizes the moment. He goes before Congress asking for authority to respond. The result is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed almost unanimously, giving him essentially a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. The irony drips heavy. A war without a formal declaration, launched on the back of an incident many historians now believe was exaggerated or misunderstood. Here's a lesser-known detail. Johnson privately admitted to aides that, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." It's one of those lines that makes you chuckle darkly, the kind of gallows humor leaders use when the truth is too awkward to say out loud. Historians still debate whether Johnson felt trapped by events or whether he manipulated the incident to secure congressional approval. Either way, the effect is the same: escalation. By March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops officially land at Da Nang. The advisors label is gone. The war America tried to avoid has now become America's war. You wander through a village near Da Nang as Marines march in, their boots thudding against the earth. Children gather, some curious, others wary. The soldiers hand out candy, a gesture meant to win hearts and minds, but the parents keep their distance. They've seen soldiers before: French, Japanese, Viet Minh. Uniforms change, but occupation feels the same. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong grow bolder. They ambush convoys, set booby traps, vanish into tunnels. You stumble across one of those tunnels, crouching low through a narrow, suffocating passage. It smells of earth and sweat, but it's also a hive of activity. Maps on the walls, weapons stacked neatly, fighters whispering about their next strike. These tunnels, stretching for miles, are cities underground. To the Viet Cong, they're safety. To the Americans, they're nightmares. And then there's the North Vietnamese Army, no longer just a shadow in the background. Backed by China and the Soviet Union, they begin moving men and supplies south in greater numbers. The Ho Chi Minh Trail snakes deeper, trucks rumbling through jungle under cover of night. Despite relentless bombing, the trail survives, repaired each time a bridge is blown, rerouted each time a path is cut. You watch workers by lantern light, laying logs across a river, their determination as steady as the current itself. By 1965, Johnson commits more and more troops, convinced that graduated escalation will force Hanoi to back down. The idea is simple: the harder America hits, the sooner the enemy will quit. But in the jungles you walk through, the logic feels flimsy. Each village bombed, each field burned, seems to recruit more fighters to the other side. Here's a quirky scene: American soldiers blasting rock music from helicopters, Creedence Clearwater Revival echoing across rice paddies. To them, it's a taste of home. To villagers, it's just another foreign noise thundering through their lives. Historians still argue whether there was ever a viable light touch option. more aid, more advisors, but no massive troop deployments, or whether Vietnam was destined to spiral no matter what. What you see is a steady slide. One more commitment, one more promise, each step justified as temporary, each step sinking deeper into the swamp. And so, by the mid-1960s, the stage is set. South Vietnam's government is unstable. The Viet Cong are everywhere. The North is emboldened, and America is now fully in the fight. Johnson promises victory. His generals talk of light at the end of the tunnel. But you, standing in a muddy trench with young Americans staring wide-eyed at the jungle, feel only the heavy truth. The tunnel may not have an end. The jungle presses close around you now, thick with heat and the smell of damp vegetation. Cicadas whine overhead, and somewhere in the distance a helicopter chops the air. You're in 1964, 1965, when Vietnam slips fully into America's hands, not by accident, but by a chain of choices, fear, and political theater. The South Vietnamese government, unstable and riddled with corruption, clings to U.S. aid like a drowning man to driftwood. The North Vietnamese, meanwhile, sharpen their plans, patient as hunters in the dark. A mainstream fact frames this turning point. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964 gave President Lyndon B. Johnson sweeping powers to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration. By March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang. What began as an advisory mission had become a full-scale American war. You can hear Johnson's voice echo through a radio in a Saigon bar, promising he seeks no wider war. The soldiers, sipping warm beer, exchange knowing glances, because the war is already wide enough. Each week brings more deployments, more boots in the mud. By the end of 1965, there are nearly 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. The streets of Saigon hum with jeeps, GIs swaggering in sunglasses, and black market hustlers selling everything from Coca-Cola to nylon stockings. Yet beyond the city, the countryside burns. You wander into a village after a search and destroy mission. The huts are charred, the rice paddies cratered, the people staring in silent rage. To the American units, this was a tactical sweep meant to root out Viet Cong fighters. To the villagers, it looks like punishment. The Hearts and Minds campaign shrinks with every bomb that misses its mark. Here's a quirky tidbit. During some of these early years, U.S. commanders carried around little kill cards, decks of playing cards with Viet Cong silhouettes printed on them to help soldiers identify targets in the jungle, as if the war could be reduced to a game of spades and hearts. Meanwhile, the Gulf of Tonkin lingers like a shadow. Johnson uses it as justification for everything, though deep down he knows the second attack may never have happened. Historians still argue whether Johnson truly believed the reports or simply saw an opportunity. Some claim he felt trapped by Cold War logic, better to escalate than risk appearing weak. Others suggest he deliberately seized the moment to get Congress on board. Whatever his motives, the result is clear. Vietnam becomes the crucible of his presidency. You drift back onto the deck of a destroyer in the Gulf, where sailors recall the night of August 4th, 1964. The radar blips looked suspicious. The gunfire rained into darkness, but no wreckage was ever found. One sailor mutters that they were shooting at phantoms. Another jokes it might have been a school of fish. And yet, out of those shadows rose a war that would consume tens of thousands of lives. By 1965, Johnson authorizes Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The sky above Hanoi roars with American jets, bombs tumbling like rain. Bridges collapse, supply depots vanish in fireballs, villages shudder under the blasts. Johnson and his generals hope the campaign will break Hanoi's will, force them to the table. But what you see on the ground tells a different story. Peasants working under strafing fire, children carrying bricks to rebuild bombed schools, fighters tightening their grip on rifles. Each explosion seems to harden their resolve. Historians still debate whether rolling thunder was a colossal miscalculation or simply constrained by politics. US commanders weren't allowed to bomb certain targets, Chinese border areas, Soviet ships, fearing escalation into World War. So the strikes fell in cycles, often telegraphed, giving North Vietnamese defenses time to adapt. Instead of shock and awe, it became a grim rhythm of destruction and recovery. You walk along the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night, lanterns flickering as porters carry crates on their backs. Despite the bombing, the trail lives. Bridges are rebuilt, paths rerouted. What was supposed to be cut off becomes stronger, like a vine pruned only to grow back thicker. In the villages, the Viet Cong fight their own war, a war of shadows. Booby traps made from bamboo spikes, tunnels stretching under the earth, sudden ambushes in dense foliage. You step into a tunnel outside Cu Chi, crouching low, the air stifling. There are kitchens here, workshops, even meeting halls. Entire communities live underground, invisible to helicopters overhead. For American soldiers, the jungle feels haunted, enemies appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Meanwhile, Johnson fights a second war at home, the war of perception. He fears losing support, fears the domino theory, fears the headlines calling him weak. His advisors show him charts and kill counts, insisting victory is coming. You sit in on one of those meetings, watching generals point at body count graphs as though dead enemies on paper could measure success. Outside the conference room, protesters already gather with signs that read, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Here's a small but telling detail. Johnson was so haunted by Vietnam that he had phones installed in his bathroom, unwilling to leave calls unanswered. Imagine sitting in the tub while being briefed on a firefight half a world away. It's almost absurd, almost tragic. The year 1965 becomes the hinge. US forces escalate, combat becomes daily, and Vietnam transforms into a war not just for villages and jungles, but for America's soul. Soldiers write home about firefights that blur into nightmares. Villagers curse both sides, trapped between bombs and bullets. And you, wandering from Saigon's neon glow to the muddy fields of the Mekong Delta, feel how quickly the dream of a quick war has rotted into the dread of a long one. Historians still argue whether Johnson ever truly believed in victory. Some say he always saw Vietnam as a sideshow to his Great Society programs at home, but feared walking away. Others think he trusted his generals too much, convinced attrition would wear the enemy down. What you see in his weary face on television is a man caught between ambition and fear, escalation and paralysis. And through it all, the whispers of the Gulf of Tonkin echo. One murky night, one set of radar blips, one congressional resolution, and now you're standing in a war that feels endless. As the monsoon rains begin, you duck under a palm thatch roof, water pouring like the sky itself is bleeding. The villagers sit quietly, bowls empty, eyes weary. Somewhere in the jungle, the Viet Cong prepare another ambush. Somewhere in Washington, Johnson drafts another speech about progress. And you, soaked to the bone, realize the truth. The storm has only just begun. The rain hasn't stopped. It drums steadily on the jungle canopy, dripping through leaves onto your shoulders as you step into the heart of the mid-1960s war. The jungle hums with mosquitoes, the air thick enough to chew. Here, the American strategy is already set. Fight a war of attrition. General William Westmoreland, commander of US forces, insists the key is simple. If the Americans kill more of the enemy than the enemy kills of them, eventually, Hanoi will give up. On paper, it sounds logical. On the ground, slogging through mud and tangled vines, it feels less like strategy and more like gambling with lives. A mainstream fact. By 1967, US troop strength in Vietnam surpassed 485,000. The war had become America's largest overseas commitment since World War II. Westmoreland's search and destroy missions scoured villages, jungles, and rice paddies in hopes of flushing out Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army (NVA) forces. The primary metric of success? Body counts. You join an American patrol moving through tall elephant grass, sweat soaking every inch of fabric. Their radios crackle with updates. Their eyes scan nervously for tripwires. A sergeant mutters that they're counting bodies, not acres. And you realize how strange it is to measure progress in corpses instead of territory. They clear a hamlet, tally a few dead fighters, and radio it in as victory. But the villagers left homeless, the children crying in the rubble, don't count in that equation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some U.S. commanders demanded detailed kill ratios, like baseball stats, so soldiers started inflating numbers. After firefights, enemy bodies were overcounted or assumed. A sarcastic GI once joked, "According to HQ, we've killed more VC than there are people in Vietnam." Gallows humor, sharp as a bayonet. Historians still argue whether attrition could ever have worked. Supporters claim that North Vietnam simply absorbed unbearable losses. Critics argue the U.S. misunderstood the enemy's endurance, will, and ability to replace fighters. What you see, trudging with a squad through knee-deep water, is a war where the enemy refuses to play by the rules America chose. The Viet Cong blend back into the landscape, indistinguishable from the civilians around them. They lay punji traps, bamboo stakes coated in excrement, hidden under leaves that pierce boots and infect wounds. They strike convoys, then melt into the forest. You crawl into a Viet Cong tunnel, the ceiling low, air heavy, rooms carved underground with kitchens venting smoke through hidden chimneys. Here, the war is not about battles, it's about waiting out giants. Meanwhile, the NVA fights a different role. Regular divisions slip down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, well-trained and increasingly well-armed, supplied by China and the Soviet Union. They fight more conventional battles at places like Nha Drang in 1965, where U.S. helicopters ferry troops into combat. The Americans unleash artillery and air power, inflicting heavy casualties. Westmoreland declares it proof that attrition works, but the NVA sees it differently. They survived, they stood toe-to-toe, and they can endure. You sit by a campfire with U.S. soldiers after such a battle. One writes in his diary, "We won today, but the jungle feels endless." Another stares into the fire, silent, haunted by faces he can't forget. Officially, it's a victory. Emotionally, it feels hollow. Back in Washington, Johnson clings to these numbers, pointing to kill counts as proof the war is winnable. He speaks of light at the end of the tunnel, though privately he confesses doubts. You picture him late at night, cigarette smoke curling in the Oval Office, muttering that the war is a bitch of a mess. And still, the troops pour in. Here's another odd detail. U.S. forces dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than all sides combined in World War II. Villages shook under rolling thunder, jungles shredded, rivers clogged with mudslides. Yet the enemy kept coming. It's almost surreal. How do you bomb a willpower that grows stronger with each blast? The strain spreads to the soldiers. Jungle fatigue sets in. Leeches clinging to skin, malaria stalking camps, endless patrols that find nothing but empty huts. Some soldiers carry photographs of girlfriends back home, plastic wrapped against the rain, clutching them like talismans. One GI mutters to you, "This place eats men whole." Historians still debate the psychological cost of fighting an enemy without clear front lines. Was the real defeat not military, but mental? When soldiers and citizens alike stopped believing? Perhaps. Because the jungle isn't just swallowing bullets, it's swallowing faith. Meanwhile, in the countryside, villagers are caught in the crossfire. The South Vietnamese government tries pacification programs, offering schools and aid, but corruption siphons it away. The Viet Cong, on the other hand, mix terror with persuasion, sometimes bringing food, sometimes executing village chiefs loyal to Saigon. You listen to a farmer whisper, "We don't care who wins, we just want peace." His words hang heavy in the humid night. Here's one of those moments that feels like dark irony. In order to measure success, U.S. officers sometimes demanded body counts per village cleared. It led to tragedies where civilians became statistics, their lives erased in reports labeled enemy combatants. Later, when the Pentagon Papers came to light, Americans would learn just how distorted those numbers had been. But here, in the jungle, you see it in real time. Progress written in blood that never feels like victory. Westmoreland keeps pushing, convinced attrition will grind the enemy down. But in Hanoi, leaders like Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Yap adopt the opposite view. They don't need to win. They just need not to lose. Time is their ally. They know Americans grow weary faster than Vietnamese peasants defending their soil. At night, lying under a mosquito net, you hear both sides whisper in different tones but with the same rhythm. Just hold on. The other side will break first. And so, attrition becomes not a strategy of winning, but of waiting. Every firefight, every body count, every bombing raid pulls the war deeper into stalemate. The jungle doesn't care who dies. The rice grows back after craters fill with rain. Villagers rebuild huts where ashes still smolder. The land itself seems patient, older than empires, waiting to outlast another invader. You stand at the edge of a paddy field at dawn, mist curling low, the distant sound of helicopters rumbling like thunder. For a moment, it almost looks beautiful, peaceful even. Then the crack of gunfire snaps the illusion. You realize attrition isn't just killing soldiers, it's killing the idea that victory has meaning. The jungle is never quiet for long. Even when the guns fall silent, there's the hum of insects, the distant rumble of artillery, the whisper of something moving where your eyes can't follow. And here, in the thick of Vietnam, you learn quickly that the enemy doesn't always come marching in neat rows. Sometimes, he's the farmer planting rice in the morning, the trader smiling in the market, the woman carrying firewood. By nightfall, those same faces can vanish into the tree line with rifles slung across their backs. A mainstream fact. The Viet Cong, also known as the National Liberation Front, were Southern insurgents who fought alongside North Vietnam against the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government. They specialized in guerrilla tactics, ambushes, traps, hit-and-run attacks, and their ability to blend with civilians made them one of the most elusive foes the U.S. military ever faced. You step carefully down a jungle path behind a squad of American soldiers. Their nerves are taut, their eyes darting left and right. Suddenly, a muffled snap. The man in front drops screaming into a camouflaged pit lined with sharpened bamboo spikes. A punji trap. The squad freezes, then frantically pulls him out as blood soaks his boot. One soldier mutters, "Charlie's everywhere." You realize he's not wrong. The Viet Cong seem woven into the land itself. Here's a quirky tidbit. Viet Cong fighters sometimes wore rubber sandals made from old tires. Durable, cheap, and nearly silent, they left ambiguous footprints that could confuse trackers. American troops joked that Ho Chi Minh sandals were indestructible, but to the villagers who made them, they were simply clever recycling. The Cu Chi tunnels stretch beneath your feet, an underground labyrinth where the Viet Cong hid, lived, and fought. You crawl inside one tunnel, the walls closing in, the air stifling. It's astonishing. Kitchens with vents disguised as termite mounds, hospitals lit by oil lamps, weapons workshops hammering away in the dark. Soldiers lie in wait with mosquito nets, their rifles within reach. To the U.S. military, these tunnels were nightmares, places where the jungle literally swallowed the enemy whole. Historians still argue whether the Viet Cong could have sustained their insurgency without North Vietnam's backing. Some say the movement had deep southern roots, born of resentment towards Saigon's corruption. Others insist the northern supply lines and training were essential. Either way, you see how the insurgency thrives on both ideology and necessity. Ambushes strike like lightning. A convoy winds along a narrow road, the air heavy with heat. Suddenly, shots crack from the tree line, grenades explode, and chaos erupts. The Viet Cong melt back into the foliage before air support even arrives. You stand amid the smoke, the silence after, the fear that it could happen again anywhere, anytime. The traps are relentless. Bamboo whips studded with spikes snap from hidden trenches. Mines concealed in food cans rip through patrols. Even the landscape itself feels like an enemy. Soldiers stomp through tall grass, each step a gamble. Some grow paranoid, seeing traps in every shadow, unable to sleep without jolting awake. You hear one GI whisper, "This whole damn place wants us dead." Meanwhile, in Hanoi, the strategy is clear. Combine the Viet Cong's guerrilla pressure with the NVA's conventional strength. The South bleeds from within, while the North pushes from above. You imagine a chessboard where every pawn can also turn into a hidden knife. Back in Saigon, officials try to downplay the insurgency. They boast about clearing operations, wave reports of pacified villages. But you've walked through those villages. You've seen government soldiers by day, Viet Cong recruiters by night. One farmer shrugs and tells you, "Whoever comes, we feed them rice. Whoever leaves, we say nothing." Survival, not loyalty, guides his life. Here's an odd yet telling moment. American soldiers occasionally found propaganda leaflets slipped into their camps overnight. One showed a weary GI sitting in the jungle with the caption, "Why die in a foreign land for corrupt men?" It's psychological warfare, subtle but sharp. Some soldiers laughed. Others folded the leaflets into their pockets, unable to shake the thought. Historians still debate whether the U.S. military ever found an effective counter to guerrilla warfare. Programs like the Phoenix program later targeted Viet Cong infrastructure, but at great moral and political cost. Search and destroy missions brought temporary victories, but they rarely held territory. The guerrilla model thrived on patience. As one Viet Cong fighter reportedly said, "You have the watches, but we have the time." And time favors those who know the land. You walk through a mangrove swamp, your boots sinking, mosquitoes buzzing in clouds. To American troops, this is misery. To Viet Cong, it's home ground. They know where the water hides leeches, where the trees conceal snipers, where the paths twist like mazes. They vanish into shadows, and you're left with the eerie certainty that you're being watched. The psychological toll grows. Soldiers nickname parts of the jungle Indian country, the green hell. Some carry rabbit's feet or Bible verses for luck, clinging to anything that promises survival. A few carve tally marks on helmets, counting days left in their tour. The fear of traps and unseen enemies gnaws deeper than the firefights. And yet, the Viet Cong themselves live in hardship. You step into a jungle camp, fighters chewing on meager rations of rice and cassava, rifles slung across thin shoulders. They joke to keep spirits high, sing songs under the stars. Malaria, hunger, exhaustion, they endure it all. What sustains them isn't comfort, but conviction, the belief that they're defending their homeland. Back in the United States, television news begins to show glimpses of this strange war. Burning villages, wounded soldiers, body bags. But what the cameras can't capture is this feeling you have now, that the jungle itself has chosen sides and it's not with the outsiders. As you step out of the tunnels, blinking in the humid sunlight, you realize something sobering. The Viet Cong don't need to win in the traditional sense. They just need to survive, to bleed the enemy slowly, to turn every patrol into a nightmare. The Americans, with their helicopters and napalm, fight battles. The Viet Cong fight time. And time, here in the shadows of the jungle, feels infinite. The jungle drips with rain as you step into a village half hidden in the mist. It should feel peaceful, roosters crowing, children darting between bamboo huts, but the air is thick with tension. This is the true battlefield now. Not just the jungles and rice paddies, but the minds and loyalties of ordinary people. In Vietnam, whoever controls the villagers controls the future. A mainstream fact sets the stage. The United States and South Vietnam launched several initiatives to win the support of rural populations, most notably the Strategic Hamlet Program, 1962. The idea was to relocate villagers into fortified settlements, separating them from Viet Cong influence. On paper, it was a counterinsurgency masterstroke. In practice, it often uprooted communities, sparked resentment, and handed the Viet Cong powerful propaganda. You walk along the edge of one such hamlet. Barbed wire encircles it. Guard towers loom above, and inside, huts stand in ordered rows. Soldiers patrol the entrances, checking papers. A woman stares at you with weary eyes, whispering that her family's ancestral graves are now miles away, left behind when the army forced them here. She doesn't feel safer, she feels stolen from.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Some hamlets were so poorly planned that villagers secretly tunneled out at night to tend their old rice fields. Soldiers guarding the perimeter often discovered the strategic hamlet empty by dawn. It was defense on paper, disobedience in practice. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong exploited every misstep. They slipped into hamlets under cover of night, spreading whispers. Your government takes your land, your family, your dignity. We fight for you. Sometimes they left behind food, sometimes pamphlets, sometimes simply a promise that they'd return. In the morning, Saigon soldiers saw only frightened villagers, unsure who to trust. Historians still argue whether counterinsurgency in Vietnam ever had a real chance. Some point to successful hearts and minds campaigns in Malaya or the Philippines as possible models. Others insist Vietnam was too fragmented. Ethnic divisions, religious tensions, and political corruption made true reform nearly impossible. What you feel, standing in that hamlet, is that sincerity was missing. Programs that could have built trust instead came wrapped in barbed wire. Propaganda became another battlefield. Loudspeakers blared government slogans in villages, while Viet Cong radio broadcasts mocked American generals with biting sarcasm. Leaflets fluttered from planes. The U.S. is here to help. Villagers used them as kindling. The Viet Cong's leaflets promised land reform and justice. Villagers tucked them under mats, unsure but curious. And then came the Buddhist crisis of 1963, a wound that never fully healed. You recall the sight of monks burning in Saigon streets, their silent protest against Ngo Dinh Diem's favoritism toward Catholics and repression of Buddhists. Even after Diem's assassination, the distrust lingered. Monks held marches, villagers lit incense for the martyrs, and the government's credibility continued to crumble. Here's another odd but telling moment. In some villages, U.S. advisors handed out transistor radios as gifts, hoping to spread pro-government news. Villagers smiled, accepted them, then tuned into Viet Cong broadcasts anyway. Technology couldn't outshout trust. You step into a classroom built with U.S. aid money. New chalkboards, bright maps, posters of smiling children in neat uniforms. It looks hopeful, even heartwarming. But then you notice the teacher, muttering under her breath about missing paychecks. The students, sneaking glances at brothers who joined the guerrillas. Education was meant to be a weapon against insurgency, but the gaps between promise and reality often widened the cracks. Historians still debate whether corruption in Saigon doomed the hearts and minds effort from the start. U.S. officials poured billions into aid programs, but much of it vanished into the pockets of generals and politicians. Villagers saw gleaming villas in Saigon, while their own roofs leaked in the rain. Every dollar stolen was another nail in the coffin of legitimacy. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong played the long game. They punished collaborators with brutal efficiency, sometimes too brutally, alienating some villagers.
but they also rewarded loyalty. Families who helped were given food, protection, or even medical care from guerrilla doctors who appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast. You picture a wounded child treated under a lantern in a jungle hut, the parents whispering gratitude that Saigon never earned. In the fields, the struggle plays out daily. A farmer plants rice by day, pays taxes to the government in one direction, and donations to the Viet Cong at night. His loyalty is survival, not ideology. And yet, each indignity from Saigon, forced relocations, corrupt officials, broken promises, nudges him further toward the rebels. Here's the quirky image you carry. Villagers joking that they had two governments, two taxes, two sets of orders. It was said half in jest, half in despair. The United States tried psychological tactics too. Operation Wandering Soul, for instance, blasted eerie recordings of ghostly voices through jungles at night, exploiting Vietnamese beliefs about restless spirits. The tapes wailed, "Leave this place, you will die." Soldiers hoped to scare guerrillas into abandoning positions. In practice, many Viet Cong shrugged it off, while some Americans admitted it scared them more than the enemy. And then there were the civic action teams, medics treating villagers, engineers digging wells. Some genuinely made a difference, and for a moment, trust bloomed. But it was fragile, often undone by the next bombing raid or the next corrupt official demanding bribes. You see it in the villagers' eyes. Gratitude one day, bitterness the next. Historians still wrestle with this paradox. Could America ever have truly won hearts and minds while propping up a regime so widely seen as illegitimate? Or was the whole project doomed, like trying to build a house on sand? You walk through another hamlet at dusk. Children chase each other through dusty streets. Women cook over small fires. Soldiers lean against guard posts. It almost looks normal, almost feels secure. Then you notice a farmer slipping away into the fields, a satchel slung across his shoulder. By midnight, he'll be miles away, carrying supplies down a hidden trail to the guerrillas. The hamlet sleeps under barbed wire, but its loyalty is already gone. As night falls, you hear frogs croak, dogs bark, and somewhere far off, the pop of gunfire. The war for hearts and minds is messy, contradictory, and endless. And you, standing in the shadows of the hamlet's watchtower, understand the truth. Bombs and bullets decide battles, but trust and betrayal decide wars. The year is 1968, and you can feel the weight of it pressing down like the humid air before a storm. Vietnam has been grinding for years now. Search and destroy missions, body counts, nightly news reports filled with grim faces. The U.S. command insists the enemy is on the ropes, that progress is being made. Westmoreland himself tells America that victory is just around the corner. But the jungle has a way of lying in wait, and what comes next is the kind of shock that makes entire nations question everything they've been told. A mainstream fact: the Tet Offensive, launched in late January 1968 during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, was a massive, coordinated assault by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army across more than 100 towns and cities, including Saigon and Hue. Militarily, it was a disaster for the communists. They lost tens of thousands of fighters. Politically, it was a masterstroke. The images of Viet Cong attacks in supposedly secure areas shattered the illusion that the U.S. and South Vietnam were winning. You're in Saigon as it begins. Firecrackers should be crackling in celebration of Tet, but instead you hear the rattle of machine guns. Streets erupt with gunfire as Viet Cong fighters in black pajamas storm government buildings. A group attacks the U.S. Embassy compound itself. For hours, gunshots echo through the capital as Americans crouch behind sandbags, stunned that the enemy could strike at the very heart of their presence. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Hue, one of Vietnam's ancient capitals, North Vietnamese troops seized control and raised the red and yellow flag of revolution over the citadel.
For nearly a month, U.S. Marines fought house to house to retake the city. They called it the Stalingrad of Vietnam, a brutal, urban battle where every block was contested. Imagine trying to fight while monks prayed in ruined pagodas and civilians fled through alleys choked with rubble. Historians still argue whether the Tet Offensive was a victory or defeat for the communists. Tactically, they were devastated. Estimates say over 40,000 killed. But strategically, they struck where it mattered most: American public opinion. The sight of fighting inside Saigon, the televised chaos, and the body bags undermined years of official optimism. Walter Cronkite, the trusted news anchor, famously declared the war mired in stalemate. President Johnson reportedly sighed, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." You move through the aftermath in a small village where the Viet Cong briefly held sway. Government officials had been executed in the square, their families left trembling. Then, ARVN troops returned, rounding up suspected collaborators, sometimes innocent farmers. In the crossfire of ideology, it's the villagers who pay the price. One elderly woman mutters that she's buried more sons than she can count, and none of them chose this war. Back in the U.S., protests explode. Students march on Washington chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." Mothers carry photographs of dead sons to rallies. Soldiers returning home are greeted not with parades, but with jeers. You stand in the crowd as chants echo against the walls of the Capitol. Vietnam is no longer a faraway conflict. It's in the living rooms of America, flickering in black and white on the nightly news. Here's an odd little detail. During Tet, the Viet Cong smuggled weapons into cities by hiding them in coffins and flower carts, rolling them past unsuspecting guards. The very symbols of holiday and mourning became tools of insurgency. And yet, for the soldiers still in the jungle, Tet doesn't feel like politics. It feels like firefights that never end. You crouch with a squad outside Hue, the air thick with smoke, as they kick in doors and clear rooms. The Marines mutter about Charlie popping out of nowhere, about the endless snipers and shattered windows. Victory here looks like a pile of rubble and a city reduced to ash. Historians still debate the psychological effect of Tet on U.S. leaders. Westmoreland asked for more than 200,000 additional troops afterward, convinced that doubling down could finally break the enemy. Johnson, politically battered and facing protests at home, refused. Weeks later, Johnson stunned the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. In many ways, the Tet Offensive toppled not just buildings in Saigon, but the confidence of an entire presidency. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, leaders celebrated the offensive as proof of resilience. Even though their forces suffered catastrophic losses, they had demonstrated that nowhere was safe for the Americans. The message was clear: you may kill us, but you cannot contain us. You drift back into Saigon weeks later. The city looks battered but alive. Markets reopen, children play, soldiers smoke and laugh nervously. But something fundamental has changed. You can see it in the eyes of the South Vietnamese civilians. Before, many believed the Americans might hold the line. After Tet, they know the enemy can strike anywhere, anytime. Fear lingers like smoke after a fire. Here's a quirky human detail. Some South Vietnamese families who had fled during Tet returned to find their homes used as Viet Cong hideouts. They joked bitterly about charging rent to uninvited guests, a dark humor that barely hides the trauma. The American press corps seizes on the shock. Headlines read, "Enemy stronger than ever. Saigon attacked. Hue in flames." Even though US and ARVN forces eventually regain control, the narrative has shifted irreversibly. You feel it in your bones. Wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won or lost on television screens and dinner table conversations. And so the Tet Offensive becomes the turning point. Not because it destroyed the US military, it didn't, but because it destroyed the illusion of progress.
From now on, every official claim of light at the end of the tunnel is met with skepticism. Every speech about victory sounds hollow. The credibility gap yawns wide, and into it falls America's faith in the war. You walk through a cemetery at dusk, incense smoke curling into the air. Rows of graves mark the cost on both sides. Children chase fireflies among the stones, as if life insists on continuing. But you sense that for many, Tet marked the moment when hope died, and survival became the only dream left. The jungle hums again, indifferent as ever, and you know the war has entered a new phase, one where belief itself is the most contested ground. The air above Vietnam vibrates with an unholy roar. Jet engines scream, bombs whistle, and the ground shakes beneath your feet. It is the sound of Operation Rolling Thunder, America's great gamble in the sky. The Tet Offensive has shown the world, but the enemy is still strong, and Washington answers with firepower. Miles of steel, tons of explosives, rain from above meant to break the North's spirit. But here, standing in the middle of a rice paddy as bombs fall on the horizon, you sense the paradox. The more America drops, the more stubborn the Vietnamese become. A mainstream fact: Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968, was a sustained bombing campaign aimed at crippling North Vietnam's infrastructure, cutting supply lines, and pressuring Hanoi into negotiations. Over 3 years, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than were dropped by all sides in World War II. Bridges collapsed. Power plants vanished in firestorms. Villages burned. Yet the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam's lifeline through Laos and Cambodia, kept flowing, rebuilt after every raid. You walk along a section of the trail one night. Lanterns bob in the dark as men and women push bicycles stacked with rice sacks, ammunition, even artillery parts. Children scurry with messages. Soldiers crouch in dugouts waiting for orders. The path winds through jungle so dense you can barely see the sky. Suddenly, bombs thunder in the distance, shaking leaves loose like rain. The workers pause, wait it out, then keep moving. The trail isn't just a road, it's a bloodstream, and it keeps pumping no matter how often arteries are cut. Here's a quirky tidbit. North Vietnamese engineers sometimes camouflaged bomb craters by filling them with water and stocking them with fish. Villagers would later catch dinner where American pilots thought they'd left destruction. A dark joke, perhaps, but also proof that resilience can turn even craters into ponds. Back in the cockpit of a U.S. fighter jet, you feel the power of modern war. Napalm canisters tumble downward, exploding in sheets of fire. Pilots watch villages vanish in orange blossoms. Some cheer, others fall silent, haunted by what they see. One whispers over the radio, "We're burning ants with magnifying glasses." It's a chilling metaphor. The jungle looks endless, and the ants never stop moving. Historians still argue whether Rolling Thunder was doomed by political constraints. The U.S. avoided bombing certain strategic targets, ports with Soviet ships, areas near the Chinese border, for fear of escalating into a world war. Critics say these limits made the campaign ineffective. Supporters claim the sheer weight of destruction slowed the enemy. Yet the evidence is here, in front of you. Trucks still roll down the trail, guerrillas still fight in the south, and Hanoi still refuses to bow. You drift into Hanoi itself during a bombing raid. Sirens wail. Families scramble into shelters. Mothers clutch children under stairways. The ground shakes as bombs fall on rail yards and factories. Yet when the dust settles, the city breathes again. Workers clear rubble. Students write lessons on blackboards in basements. Soldiers march through smoke. Instead of breaking morale, the raids often steal it. You hear a man whisper, "If we survive this, nothing can stop us." Here's another odd detail. rolling thunder sometimes hit the same bridges dozens of times, only for them to be rebuilt within days using bamboo scaffolding and hand labor. American pilots joked bitterly about permanent targets that never seemed to stay destroyed.
In Laos and Cambodia, the war spreads in secret. The Ho Chi Minh Trail snakes through their jungles, and so the bombs follow. Villages not even officially at war tremble under U.S. firepower. Farmers flee into caves, entire provinces scarred. Later, historians will call it one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history. Yet it remains largely hidden from American newspapers at the time. You sit with a group of peasants in central Vietnam after a raid. Their thatched roofs lie in ashes, but they speak of rebuilding tomorrow. One man shrugs and says, "We eat less rice, we fight harder." For him, bombs don't mean surrender. They mean confirmation that his struggle matters. Meanwhile, in Washington, generals insist rolling thunder is working. Charts show tons of bombs dropped, bridges destroyed, trucks obliterated. But you remember the body counts from the ground war? How numbers can deceive. A destroyed truck is easily replaced. A demolished bridge is quickly rebuilt. What can't be measured is willpower. And willpower is what Hanoi has in abundance. Historians still debate the real purpose of rolling thunder. Was it meant to destroy, to deter, or simply to show America was serious? Some argue it was more about sending messages than winning battles. But to the villagers hiding in ditches, the message was simple. America will burn your land if it must. And to the Viet Cong fighter crouched in a trench, the answer was equally simple. Then we will fight from the ashes. The cost for America is staggering, not just in money, but in morale. Pilots are shot down, captured, paraded through Hanoi as prisoners. Names like John McCain become part of the war's lore. You imagine the cramped cells, the hunger, the beatings, the endless nights of interrogation. For every bombing run, there is a risk of ending up behind bars instead of back at base. And yet, the bombings continue until 1968, when Johnson finally halts rolling thunder amid public pressure and lack of progress. 3 years of fire, billions of dollars, and countless lives. Yet Hanoi stands, the trail thrives, and the war rages on. Here's a quirky, almost surreal memory. American commanders once bragged about dropping so many bombs that Vietnam ought to be back in the Stone Age. Yet when you walk through a village after the rain, you see women planting rice shoots in bomb craters. The crops grow. Life insists on returning, stubborn as weeds and sidewalk cracks. As the sun sets, you stand on a ridge overlooking the jungle. Smoke curls into the sky. Fire flickers in the distance, but the green canopy still stretches unbroken. Bombs may scar it, but they don't erase it. The war of machines clashes against the war of patience, and patience still holds the upper hand. The Americans believed rolling thunder would bring Hanoi to its knees. Instead, it brought them deeper into the quagmire, proving that firepower cannot bend to people who have already decided they will outlast the storm. You sit in a living room, thousands of miles away from the steaming jungles. The carpet is shaggy, the television is humming, and dinner is cooling on plates as the nightly news begins. Suddenly, the war bursts into American homes, raw and unfiltered. No longer just headlines in newspapers. Vietnam is now an image, a sound, a story, told each night in color or black and white. And here, far from Saigon, far from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, another battlefield opens. The battlefield of public opinion. A mainstream fact. The Vietnam War was the first conflict to be televised extensively. Images of firefights, burning villages, and body bags appeared on evening broadcasts watched by millions of Americans. The credibility gap, the difference between official government statements and what people saw with their own eyes, grew wider with each broadcast. You imagine a family gathered around the set in 1965. The father adjusts the antenna. The mother pours coffee. Children watch wide-eyed.
a reporter's voice cuts through. Today, in Vietnam, heavy fighting erupted near Da Nang. American forces suffered casualties, but commanders report progress. And then, the footage rolls. Soldiers dragging wounded comrades through mud, helicopters lifting off with blood dripping from their floors. Progress looks like exhaustion, fear, and endless funerals. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most watched American shows in the 1960s was The Andy Griffith Show, a gentle comedy about small-town life. Families would laugh at Andy and Barney one minute, then flip channels to see burning huts in Vietnam. The contrast was surreal. Mayberry by day, Mekong Delta by night. The press corps in Saigon grows restless. They hear generals insist the war is being won, yet they ride helicopters to villages reduced to ash. They listen to Johnson talk of light at the end of the tunnel, then watch the Tet Offensive erupt in city streets. Reporters scribble furiously, their dispatches painting a different picture from official briefings. Historians still argue whether the press turned the tide of public opinion or merely reflected it. Some say television coverage was too negative, undermining the war effort. Others argue the media simply showed what was happening, forcing America to confront realities leaders wanted to hide. You, sitting in that living room, feel the confusion firsthand. Whom do you believe, the president or your own eyes? In 1969, another crack widens the gap, the revelation of the My Lai massacre. American soldiers, sent to root out Viet Cong in a village, instead murdered hundreds of unarmed civilians, men, women, children. The images leak years later, bodies piled in ditches, mothers clutching babies. You see the photographs in a newspaper and feel your stomach turn. Suddenly, the line between liberator and oppressor blurs. Here's another odd detail. When news of My Lai first broke, some Americans refused to believe it, calling it enemy propaganda. Others argued that atrocities were inevitable in such a murky war. Yet over time, My Lai became a symbol, not just of one village's tragedy, but of the moral rot the war had spawned. The Pentagon Papers in 1971 drive the dagger deeper. Leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, these classified documents reveal years of deception. Presidents and officials privately admitted doubts while publicly promising progress. You leaf through one memo where Johnson's advisors concede the war is unwinnable, even as he requests more troops. The betrayal is suffocating. Americans realize their leaders not only failed, they lied. Historians still debate whether the credibility gap doomed the war more than the battlefield itself. Was it the Viet Cong who won, or was it the erosion of trust at home? Standing in a living room filled with protests on the TV, you sense the answer may be both. And oh, the protests. You step into the crowd at the 1967 March on the Pentagon. Drums pound, chants rise, flowers are tucked into rifle barrels. Students wave signs, bring the boys home, stop the slaughter. Veterans throw medals onto the Capitol steps. Tear gas wafts through the air as police clash with demonstrators. It's chaos, yes, but also democracy in motion, an entire generation demanding an end to the nightmare. Here's a quirky human moment. At one protest, demonstrators carried signs reading, "Make love, not war." Then actually kissed soldiers guarding the White House gates. Some soldiers laughed, others stiffened. But for a fleeting second, the absurdity cut through the anger. Inside the White House, presidents fret. Johnson, battered by protests, steps down in 1968. Richard Nixon enters office promising peace with honor, but his secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos, when exposed, only deepen the mistrust. Each revelation of lies fuels more protests, more division. America isn't just at war in Vietnam, it's at war with itself. You sit in a college dorm room as students debate late into the night. Some argue that America has no business fighting in a distant jungle. Others insist abandoning South Vietnam would betray allies. One young man slams his draft notice onto the table, cursing. Another whispers he's thinking of fleeing to Canada.
The room is thick with fear and conviction, as if the war has invaded every conversation, every future plan. Historians still argue whether the anti-war movement shortened the war or merely pressured leaders to fight it differently. What you feel listening to those voices is the raw weight of democracy. Messy, angry, divided, but impossible to ignore. And television keeps rolling. Footage of coffins unloading at airports, rows of flag-draped caskets, images of napalm-burned children running screaming down roads, reporters trudging through rice paddies, asking young soldiers what they think. One GI mutters into the camera, "I don't even know why we're here." That clip plays in living rooms from Seattle to Boston, echoing across dinner tables. Here's one final strange but telling detail. Some soldiers joked that the war was being lost not in Vietnam, but in living rooms in Kansas. They weren't wrong. Public support drained away drip by drip until leaders had no choice but to change course. You walk once more into that quiet American living room. The TV flickers, casting shadows on tired faces. The war feels closer than ever, and yet impossibly far away. Parents glance at their sons, wondering if their draft number will be called. Children ask why the men on TV look so sad, and you understand. The war is no longer only fought in jungles or tunnels. It is fought in trust, in truth, in the fragile link between a people and their leaders. In Vietnam, the jungle hums on. In America, the living room grows heavier each night. And in both places, you sense the same thing. The war is already lost in hearts long before it's lost on the battlefield. The noise of Saigon in 1975 is not the confident hum of a capital city, but the frantic clatter of a place unraveling. The air is heavy with dust, exhaust, and fear. You stand on a rooftop, watching as columns of smoke rise from the outskirts. South Vietnam, the fragile state America poured so much blood and treasure into, is collapsing before your eyes. A mainstream fact. After years of gradual U.S. withdrawal, beginning with Nixon's Vietnamization policy in 1969, the last American combat troops left in 1973. 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon. Helicopters evacuated the last Americans and some South Vietnamese allies from rooftops. The images of that chaotic exit became symbols of the U.S. defeat. But to understand this ending, you trace the unraveling back. After Tet in 1968, America's strategy shifted. Nixon promised peace with honor, gradually reducing U.S. troops while ramping up bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, were supposed to take over the fight. It looked neat on paper, but on the ground, you saw something different. ARVN soldiers often lacked morale, plagued by corruption and poor leadership. The Viet Cong might have been battered, but North Vietnamese regulars kept pressing, fed by the Ho Chi Minh Trail and unshaken by endless bombing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nixon privately called his Vietnam policy the madman theory. He wanted Hanoi to believe he was irrational enough to use nuclear weapons if pushed. Imagine that, trying to bluff with mushroom clouds. Historians still argue whether it ever fooled anyone. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 were supposed to bring an end. They promised a ceasefire, prisoner exchanges, and U.S. withdrawal. But as you walk through villages after the signing, the war never really stops. Skirmishes flare, supply lines pulse, soldiers dig trenches. The ink on the treaty dries, but bullets still fly. By 1974, North Vietnam tests the South's defenses and finds them brittle. Without massive U.S. air power to lean on, ARVN units crumble quickly. Morale sinks further as soldiers realize pay is late, supplies are short, and leaders are bickering. Meanwhile, inflation and corruption gnaw at everyday life in Saigon. A taxi driver tells you bitterly that the only people getting rich are black market smugglers and crooked officials. Historians still debate whether South Vietnam could ever have survived without permanent U.S. support. Some argue ARVN proved capable in certain battles given enough resources. Others insist the government was too corrupt and unpopular to stand alone. What you see now as columns of North Vietnamese tanks push southward is the grim answer unfolding. In March 1975, the Central Highlands collapse. Panic spreads like wildfire. Soldiers throw away uniforms. Villagers flee by the tens of thousands. Highways choked with carts and motorbikes. You walk alongside the refugees, hearing children cry, seeing old women stumble on the road. They call it the convoy of tears. The retreat turns into a rout, and within weeks, cities that once seemed safe fall like dominoes. Here's an eerie, almost surreal detail. South Vietnamese officers sometimes disguise themselves as peasants to escape capture, while peasants sometimes put on officer uniforms to loot abandoned mansions. In the chaos, roles blurred, and survival became improvisation. By April, Saigon is encircled. You stand near the U.S. Embassy, watching as helicopters thunder overhead. Crowds press against the gates, desperate to get out. Some wave documents, others cry out names, others simply beg. Marines pull people inside, but thousands are left outside. The roof of the embassy becomes a desperate launch pad, helicopters landing and lifting off in frantic rhythm. Inside one, you squeeze among evacuees clutching whatever they can carry. Photographs, a Bible, a bag of clothes. The fear in their eyes says everything. Historians still argue whether the U.S. could have evacuated more allies, or whether chaos made it inevitable that many would be left behind. The photographs of helicopters lifting off from rooftops became permanent icons of defeat. For Americans, it was humiliation. For South Vietnamese left behind, it was heartbreak. In the final hours of April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Soldiers raised the red flag with a golden star. The war is over. You wander through the halls of the palace, chandeliers glittering above rooms now abandoned. The president has fled, generals have vanished, and the long experiment of South Vietnam has ended. Here's a small, strange vignette. As the tanks rolled into Saigon, some South Vietnamese tried to act as if life went on. A few cafes opened, serving coffee to nervous patrons. One musician even strummed a guitar in a park, as though drowning out the noise of surrender with fragile notes. Survival often hides behind routine. Back in America, the images reach living rooms once again. People watch helicopters shoved off carrier decks to make room, boats crammed with refugees, Saigon renamed Ho Chi Minh City. For some, it is vindication, proof the war was unwinnable all along. For others, it is betrayal. Thousands of allies left behind to face re-education camps and reprisals. For nearly everyone, it is sorrow. Historians still debate the lessons of those final days. Was the U.S. wrong to intervene so deeply in a civil war? Was it right to withdraw when it did? Did America betray South Vietnam or simply prolong the inevitable? The arguments continue, but here in the streets of Saigon, the debate is over. You walk through the city one last time. Streets are filled with triumphant soldiers, curious children, and weary citizens. Some cheer, some weep, some simply watch. The war that defined a generation, that filled television screens, that toppled presidencies, is finished. Yet the silence that follows feels heavier than the gunfire that preceded it. Here's the last quirky detail. In the days after the fall, North Vietnamese soldiers were often surprised by the modern luxuries in Saigon. Color TVs, refrigerators, even swimming pools. Some joked that they had marched all the way south to liberate people who already seemed wealthier than they were. Liberation, like everything else in this war, looked different depending on which side of the street you stood on. And so the chapter closes. Helicopters fade into the distance, smoke curls above rooftops, and the city changes its name. For America, Vietnam becomes a wound carried into the future. For Vietnam, it becomes reunification under one flag.
For you, standing in the middle of the crowd, it feels like watching the curtain fall after a play that ran too long, too bloody, and too tragically. Night falls, and with it, the echoes of decades of struggle settle into a kind of uneasy quiet. You stand at the edge of the Saigon River, its dark waters reflecting dim city lights, and you think back to where this journey began. Colonial rule, World War, guerrilla resistance, French collapse, American escalation, villages torn between sides, jungles full of traps, and skies filled with bombs. It all converged here, in the fall of Saigon. The war is over, but the questions it raised remain unsettled, lingering like ghosts that refuse to leave. A mainstream fact: by the end of the Vietnam War, more than 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese had died. It remains one of the most divisive conflicts in U.S. history. Its legacy includes lessons in counterinsurgency, the limits of military power, the power of public opinion, and the dangers of political deception. You walk slowly through a re-education camp in the countryside. South Vietnamese officers sit in bamboo barracks, listening to lectures on Marxist-Leninist ideology. Some scribble notes, others stare blankly into the distance, their families uncertain when, or if, they'll return. For them, the war never really ended. For North Vietnam, the struggle continues too, in rebuilding a devastated land. Craters pockmark fields, cities lie in ruins, forests are scarred by Agent Orange. Victory is sweet, but costly. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the years after the war, scrap metal scavengers picked through old battlefields, melting down bomb fragments and bullet casings to turn into cooking utensils. Soup spoons made from war debris, a literal transformation of destruction into daily life. Back in the United States, veterans return to a country divided. Some are spat on at airports, called baby killers. Others retreat into silence, haunted by memories they can't share. PTSD isn't a household term yet, but you can see it in the hollow eyes of men sitting at bars, staring into glasses of whiskey. One vet mutters to you, "We fought for nothing." Another insists, "We fought for each other." Both are telling the truth. Historians still argue about the war's meaning. Was it a noble attempt to contain communism that simply overreached? Or a tragic mistake, a failure to understand Vietnamese nationalism? Was South Vietnam doomed from the start or abandoned too soon? You realize there may never be one answer. The debates themselves are part of the legacy. The credibility gap remains another scar. Citizens discovered their leaders had shaded truths, massaged statistics, and promised progress that wasn't there. The Pentagon Papers revealed the depth of deception, and ever since, Americans view government promises with sharper skepticism. In a way, Vietnam planted seeds of doubt that sprouted in later decades, from Watergate to Iraq. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. You stroll through Washington, D.C. years later, where the Vietnam Veterans Memorial stretches like a black scar of polished stone. Names upon names, etched in silence. Visitors press their palms to the granite, leaving flowers, photographs, dog tags. The wall doesn't explain, doesn't argue. It only remembers. Standing before it, you feel the war collapse into quiet grief. Here's another small, striking detail. The memorial's design, a simple V-shaped wall, was controversial at first. Critics wanted something more heroic, less somber. But when veterans began visiting, many wept openly. One said, "It's like touching the names brings them back for a moment." In that reflection, you see yourself too, fading in and out among the etched letters. For Vietnam, the lessons are equally complex. Victory brought unification, but also decades of hardship. Economic struggles, political repression, and international isolation marked the post-war years. And yet, the same resilience that carried the country through war helped it rebuild, eventually opening to the world, becoming the vibrant nation you know today.
Historians still debate whether the Vietnam War changed the trajectory of the Cold War itself. Some argue it sapped U.S. willpower, emboldening Soviet moves elsewhere. Others suggest it taught America restraint, avoiding larger nuclear confrontation. Either way, it reshaped American foreign policy. Presidents after Vietnam tread more carefully, haunted by the phrase, "no more Vietnams." You think too about the ordinary people caught in between. The farmers whose paddies were bombed, the children who grew up hearing helicopters instead of lullabies, the mothers who buried sons for causes they barely understood. Wars are told through generals and presidents, but lived through by villagers and foot soldiers. Their stories, whispered around fires or carved into scars, may be the truest legacy. Here's a quirky but poignant memory. Some U.S. soldiers carried Zippo lighters engraved with phrases like, "We are the unwilling, led by the unqualified, to do the unnecessary for the ungrateful." Gallows humor etched into steel, tiny monuments to disillusionment. And so you lie awake, listening to the ghosts of Vietnam whisper. The war taught that overwhelming firepower can fail against patience, that winning territory means little if you lose trust, that body counts don't equal victory, and that truth matters as much as bullets. Historians still argue whether America's real defeat was in the jungles or in its own living rooms. Maybe both. You know only that wars end in ruins, and the lessons they leave behind are as fragile as smoke. The night deepens. The Saigon River glimmers, the jungle hums, the wall of names in Washington stands silent, and you, drifting between them, carry the weight of Vietnam into your dreams. And now, as the echoes fade, let your breath slow. Imagine the guns falling quiet, the jungle finally at peace, the rice paddies shimmering again under soft rain. The soldiers, the villagers, the voices of leaders, all those stories that thundered through time grow distant, like fading waves on a far shore. You are lying in your own bed, safe. The hum of your room steady and calm. The harsh cries of helicopters soften into the whir of a ceiling fan. The explosions dissolve into raindrops tapping a window. Even the clamor of protests, the chants, the speeches, all of it melts into a low, indistinct murmur that lulls rather than agitates. The lessons remain, yes, but they no longer shout. They whisper gently, reminding you that wars are storms, but storms always pass. That resilience grows in quiet places, rice shoots rising again in bomb craters, laughter returning to streets once filled with fear. Even the deepest scars fade in time, becoming part of the landscape rather than its definition. As your eyelids grow heavier, picture the black granite wall of names at night, candles glowing softly at its base. There is sadness there, yes, but also peace, remembrance, and the comfort of memory kept alive. The wall does not demand answers. It offers silence, and in that silence, rest. So let yourself drift. The journey has been long, the questions vast, the images vivid. But now, none of it requires effort from you. The world can hold its own weight while you release yours. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let sleep come, soft as the river's flow, gentle as the jungle's night song.